Hammer Performance. Today we're installing a 1275 kit from Hammer Performance on this 2021 XL 883 Sportster. Should be close to doubling the horsepower of it. Should make this thing from a slow dog to a fast bike, a fun bike to ride. Looking forward to it, and let's go. First up, teardown. Get rid of the air cleaner, the support bracket, pull off the breather tubes, and finally the backing plate. Now on the other side of the bike, we will disconnect the front O2 sensor and the rear O2 sensor. Now we remove the exhaust nuts and the mounting bolts and remove the front pipe. The rear pipe is a little bit more tricky. The mounting bolts are blocked by the rear master cylinder. So we loosen the sprocket cover to gain access to the bracket bolts and pull off the rear pipe. Next, we loosen the jam nuts for the throttle cables. While we're here, we're going to add some anti-seize to the threads. That will make servicing at a later date the throttle cables a lot easier. Take your pick and remove the throttle cables from the throttle body. And disconnect the electrical connections from the throttle body. Next to go are the spark plugs, front and rear. We're going to also disconnect the fuel tank, quick connect here. And then we remove the manifold bolts on the left side of the bike. And while we're here, we're going to disconnect the motor mounts as well. Onto the other side of the bike, remove the motor mount bolt and pull out the front motor mount. Now we're going to take off these manifold bolts on the right side. And pull out the manifold. Now the fun part, we're going to get into the motor. We remove these bolts from the rocker covers. The rear ones here are kind of difficult. You might need a special tool to get these out. And pull off the rocker covers. Now we're going to put the bike into 5th gear so we can spin the wheel. But what we're looking for is the intake valve to open and close, and then it'll give us top dead center or something close to that. So we can remove the small bolts under the rocker covers and then the big bolts. And pull the rocker covers off. Don't forget to pull out the push rods, noting the different colors. The exhaust is longer than the intake, and the colors signify which one's which. To get the rear out, you may need to pull out the push rods before you pull the rocker covers, just to make it easier. Clearance is a little bit of an issue there. Now we pull out our trusty breaker bar and break the head bolts loose. And I use my snap-on automatic ratchet to zip them out really quickly after they're broken loose. And usually you have to tap on the head. Usually use my hand, not a hammer. You don't want to damage the fins, but you need to tap on it just to break the head gasket loose. And the same thing with the rear. Just be careful not to drop the pushrod tubes. Now remove the cylinders. Before you take it all the way off, I stick a rag in the crankcase. This will prevent any kind of debris from falling in there. And then pull off the cylinder. Now I have these 1/2-inch PVC pipes that I stick on the studs to protect the piston while we're working here. Alright, now it's time to file fit the rings. So we start by cleaning off the lube that's in here in the cylinder. Fitting the rings in the cylinder. And then I use the piston to make sure it's nice and square in the cylinder bore. If it's cockeyed, you won't get the correct reading. So I take my feeler gauge and feel the gap. Each application is going to be different. You want to check with the manufacturer of the rings for the correct ring gap. And here I am filing the ring to get the correct gap. And after you file it, you want to take a fine file or a stone I'm using here to deburr it. Anytime you file it, it's going to leave sharp edges, and you don't want that to scratch up the cylinder. Another thing when you're filing, you want to make sure the gap is flat across. You can put it in the filer and on an angle, and you'll have like a taper there. And you don't want that. You want them to come together evenly. And this is just me filing it, deburring it, getting rid of those burrs. And now we're done with that. I wash these with soap and water really good, and then wipe it off with a lint-free rag and oil. Now you make sure the piston is very clean. Blow it off. You don't want any debris or anything in there. Cleanliness is very, very important when you're installing cylinders and pistons. Notice the dish in the piston. That's to account for the cylinder heads of the 883. They don't have a big chamber, and if that was a flat top piston, the compression would be crazy high and wouldn't work very well for a street vehicle. Hammer Performance wants you to use assembly lube on the pistons and the rings and the cylinders. So here, that's what I'm doing. Generally, I use whatever engine oil the bike is gonna run on the cylinders and pistons. Assembly lube pretty much anywhere else, but that's what Hammer Performance specs out, so that's what it's gonna get. And make sure to wipe off and clean off the coating that's on the piston pin here. Assembly lube on that. And then I'll stick it in the bore so I can get the pin in. It's a lot easier to have the pin stop against something. Otherwise, it'll just push right through and really hard to get in the groove. And then you always want to double check and make sure that it's in the groove completely. If those things come out, it's catastrophic to the motor. And since these are file fit, they're per cylinder, I'm going to stack the piston on the cylinder and cover it with a bag so make sure everything's nice and clean, or stays nice and clean while I do the front cylinder here. Now, one thing I always do is clean up these studs. I've had them before where there's a little bit of rust on them, and it kind of makes getting their correct torque pretty impossible. So I put some oil on them, and then I use a thread chaser on the studs, and also do it on the nuts too with some oil, just to make sure they're nice and clean without any rust or burrs or anything on them. With these Cometic gaskets, getting the correct torque is very, very important, as with any head gasket. So I'll make sure I get the old gaskets off, and then I will clean this surface with a maroon Scotch-Brite. Don't go too crazy. You don't want the Scotch-Brite to get inside the motor. And then I'll take my brake cleaner on a lint-free rag and make sure that there's no oil on the gasket surface here. And then install your new base gaskets. Don't forget this. And just make sure they're oriented properly. I'm going to reinstall my PVC pipe here, and then assembly lube on the rod, small end. And then we'll get our piston in. Put it over the rod, then put the pin in and push it in. And here I'm just doing the rear. And getting the clip in. And this is where having those rags come in handy inside the crankcase. If that pin falls into the crank, it can be really hard to get it out. And here's doing the front. And just double check and make sure that those are in all the way. And I get these cylinders on with the band clamp. Works really well. You just turn it upside down. There's an up arrow on it. You want to make sure that's facing down because it's like the opposite of the way you put it in a car. And just be very careful here. You don't want to scratch the cylinder. Hold the piston and shake it. Move it around a little bit. You just want to be careful that the rings don't get pinched in between the cylinder wall. You want to make sure they're in the groove for the piston. And then remove the band clamp. And make sure you get your rag out. Make sure you get all your rags out. And set it down. And same procedure with the front. I forgot to mention before I used the band clamp, I cleaned it really well. Brake cleaner, and compressed air a few times with a lint-free rag. And yeah, once the cylinder's past the piston rings, you can remove the band clamp. Pull out your rag, very important. And here's the difference between the 883 and the 1275 here. It's a huge difference. This is going to be a fun bike. I'm just using a brake cleaner and a microfiber to make sure there's no oil on the gasket surface here, the cylinders. Don't forget to put in your pushrod tubes before you set the head on. It's been a while since I did a Sportster and I actually forgot that. I had to do this twice. On a twin camera Milwaukee 8 or even an Evo Big Twin, they're 2-piece push rods, so you can put the heads on and then the push rod tubes later. But Kinetic gaskets have a specific torque spec for this. Basically low to high, left to right. Just follow Kinetic's recommendations on the torque. Each application is going to be different. Each head gasket is going to be different for that matter. Harley gaskets use Harley or James gaskets typically use a couple torque specs and then a 90 degrees from the final torque, or 90 degrees to get the correct torque. These specific head gaskets are Kinetic, so it's about 5 different torques in sequence. Final torque is 42 foot-pounds, and those are the instructions. Don't forget to lube up your push rods, the longer ones for the exhaust in this application. And now we spin the rear wheel and you can see the intake push rod, which is the one to the right, go up and then down, and then that's relatively close to top dead center compression where we can install our parts here. Now I use my oiling can and fill up the rocker shaft with oil before I install it. And then just make sure you feed your temperature sensor wire through the hole in the top of the rocker cover. And then blue Loctite on these fasteners. And this is the opposite. You torque the big bolts first, and then the smaller bolts. repeat for the front cylinder. So the quarter 20 bolts are 10 foot-pounds, and the 3/8 bolts are like 22 foot-pounds. Consult your service manual. Here's getting the gaskets in. Just make sure they're in the groove properly. Feed your temperature sensor wire through the cover and install it. Now these bolts for the covers, I have a tendency to leak, so they come with these little gaskets. Blue Loctite, and these things get torqued to 10 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Now we got our new manifold seals. All these parts I got from Hammer Performance. They have a nice Cometic kit with the right size head gasket. Install your manifold or throttle body and install the bolts. Now get the throttle cables installed. And then we adjust the throttle cables. Now here's where the anti-seize comes in handy. Makes turning these nuts real easy. Don't forget to tighten them down and put the covers over them. Now I got to clean the old gasket off the face of the throttle body here. I like to put thread sealant on the breather bolts and blue Loctite on the bolts that go through to the throttle body. I use the 2 bolts here to locate the gasket, and then put the air filter mounting bracket on, and then torque everything down. Consult your service manual for these specs. Don't forget the breather tubes and the air filter. Nice. Fresh exhaust kits go in. The rear pipe's a little bit tricky. Remember, I have the sprocket cover loose, so I can access the bolt that's underneath that. In this situation, I disconnected the front brake too. Just made it a little bit easier. So when you tighten the exhaust, you lightly put the manifold bolts on, and then the mounting brackets, and then tighten up the cylinder head before you tighten up the mounting brackets. Now we get the front motor mount back in, and the bolts. These bolts get blue Loctite. And it's usually easier to thread these 3 bolts in before you tighten any one of them down, because they all got to be lined up pretty much. Now connect the O2 sensors, the front and the rear. And we're getting ready to start this thing. Thanks for joining me building this 1275 kit from Hammer Performance. If you like the video, like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you later. Thank you.